My name is Michael Pifer, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Middle East Studies at the University of Michigan and the Center for Armenian Studies. This is part of a series of short informative talks meant to inform the public about a single subject. And that subject today is corruption. Joining me is Dr. Aram Simonyan, an expert on anti-corruption strategies in Europe. Dr. Simonyan is currently Associate Professor of Economics at the International Scientific Educational Center of the National Academy of Sciences of Armenia. Dr. Simonyan was also a Weiser Professional Fellow at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at U of M in 2018, and is currently visiting Fulbright Scholar at the Ross School of Business at U of M this year. Dr. Simonyan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's just dive right in. First, I'd like to ask you, what is corruption? How do you define it, and what makes it so damaging to a society or an institution?
Well, it seems pretty complicated to define corruption as a whole, which may then broadly encompass all the forms of corruption from bribery to embezzlement, from nepotism to extortion. This can explain why some researchers and policymakers may narrowly define the phenomenon for the comprehension. Yet a commonly accepted definition of corruption is originally defined by the Transparency International and is outlined as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So currently, this is what I'm studying, and my recent research has predominantly posited the essence of corruption on the individual and institutional levels, looking what's damaging mainly, and currently I study those personal and institutional factors which are keenly associated with an individual's propensity to involve or abstain from illicit activities.
Well, along those lines, could you sort of sketch for us a little bit the role that corruption has played, particularly in Armenian institutions? But I'm also kind of curious about the shift of corruption before and after the fall of the Soviet Union. So if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, distrust in public institutions had been common in Armenia in the period of the Soviet Union and during the decades following it. So people didn't trust the corrupt government and public institutions. They started to look for individual or, let's say, alternative methods to get things done. Correspondingly, rather than following the official procedures, they heavily relied on their keen friendships. This structure bred clientelism and nepotism, eventually leading to distorted incentives and misallocation of resources in the economy. However, a transition to highly trusting the public institutions takes time, and most importantly, assumes the participation of each Armenian citizen in the process. Thus, one should transcend from the mindset, I can do nothing against corruption, towards engaging more responsibly for their social and civil rights.
That's really interesting. I'm curious if I could just follow up on that a little bit. What are some of the tools available to an ordinary citizen for curtailing or for stopping corruption? What can we do about it?
One of the most common tools would be if you see something happening that you realize it's illicit, it's fraudulent, then speak up about it. Don't be quiet. Don't assume that others will take charge of it or that you do not have a responsibility and that you cannot change anything about the situation. Rather, being aware that actually your voice matters and you can be the person who cuts the chain of corruption, of fraud. So being more responsible and speaking up against it, one of the things.
I'm curious more too, what forums exist maybe for speaking up if you can't report it say through bureaucratic channels or governmental channels. Have you seen, is one sort of approach more effective for people than another, or um, what are the avenues for speaking up about this issue?
So there are actually a couple of existing opportunities for ordinary citizens. Also, there is a web page when you can speak up. In Armenian,
Hmm,
it's called Azdaradid or whistleblowing mechanism.
hmm,
When you notice that something is fraudulent or against the law, actually you can even anonymously speak up,
hmm,
and then you are protected actually because depending on which option you choose, anonymously or not, if you choose anonymously, then you are also completely anonymous, and so you can feel safe and secure uh, for for your actions, and that nothing bad actually will happen, but rather they will follow up with the procedures and find who was the corrupt person and what was the whole corruption about.
hmm. I'm also, thank you. I'm also curious about what are some of the unforeseen consequences of corruption, either in Armenia or elsewhere, over the last decade? How does it affect the lives of ordinary people?
Hmm. I believe it won't be an exaggeration to say that the consequences of corruption on Armenian citizens has been dramatic. So corruption has been embedded in the Armenian political system, economy, and in culture. I reckon that a high level of corruption in Armenia is one of the underlying factors leading to the revolution in 2018. Previously, corruption deterred the economic and social development of the country. Right? The monopolies in the Armenian economy were the offspring of the stifled economic competition, leading to more poverty, higher unemployment rates in Armenia, etc.
Thank you. Uh, I'm curious, too, you've written overall that there's a lot of good reason to hope that corruption is on the decline, or at least is shifting in a way, in Armenia today. Um, Maybe the revolution is one reason, but I'm curious if you could speak more about what's caused the shift, and do we have even more reason to hope that the trend will continue?
Yes, it has been exciting to witness a kind of notable improvement in the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index this year
Mm,
as compared to that of previous years. I believe this is a direct effect of anti-corruption policy reforms introduced after the Velvet Revolution in 2018. Moreover, I consider that the real corruption as well as perceived corruption levels have dropped in Armenia.
mm,
And as for the second part of the question, I want to believe that this trend will go on and the newly formed Armenian government will consistently crack down corruption by introducing new anti-corruption compliance policies. Yeah.
mm. I'm curious, could you speak also to if there are any dangers, new or old, that could threaten this improvement? What again should people be looking out for to make sure that it continues as you describe?
So, yeah, one of the threats I see here that it was a social norm embedded in the culture, and one of the things that can happen when people being used to it get back to their comfort zone
Mm,
and not trying to challenge the old way of interaction, the old way of doing business, or the old way of communication with public officials. I think this is one of the common uh, threats for transition from more corrupt to less corrupt uh, societies that one needs to keep in mind.
Thank you. Last but not least, speaking of challenges to the old way of doing things, I have to ask a little bit about the current situation that we all find ourselves in. Um, as you know, governments around the world have had to implement um, really extreme measures to try to contain this pandemic. And so I'm curious, what have you seen, maybe globally, um, that resonates with what you're studying? Uh, to what extent has corruption created a problem, either in this country or other countries, uh, for containing the pandemic? Um, what should we be looking out for?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the allocation of massive national and international funds for supporting the citizens during the time of coronavirus pandemic has created a fertile soil for embezzlement in different
Mm,
countries worldwide, and especially for those of having high levels of corruption. To a great extent, in these very countries, the procurement contracts and projects will encounter collusion hereof. To put it simply, in the countries that having high corruption levels, ordinary citizens of somewhat not being able to bribe may be disadvantaged from public health care, coronavirus testing, and so forth. Getting back to Armenia, actually, I think nowadays an Armenian citizen is predominantly safe from this kind of risk, which in turn is thought to be a significant achievement.
mm. Well, thank you so much. That's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us at home. And again, thank you to Dr. Simonian. And we will see you next time.
Thank you very much for having me.